Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate. Thank you, Ron. I appreciate first opportunity to come to Perth. I have a paper, but I'm not going to be delivering the paper as such. If you would like to have a copy of the paper, it's not terribly long, but about money and liberty, send an email to me at soundmoney@mac.com. Just as it says, no spaces, no underscores, anything. Soundmoney@mac.com, and I'll send you the paper. A couple of other things I've recently written in opinion editorial pieces for newspapers tying together fiscal monetary policy. I was trying to think about how do I tie together a subject of money and liberty with Islam and Rome to make some coherence of this. The only thing that occurs to me is I know my former colleagues in the central banks around the world probably, but certainly in the United States, would like to borrow from Islam and make criticizing the central bank subject to death. And it's getting more vocal in the States. We're now repeating some of the patterns of Rome, of move it to the government, the ratchet effect, move things more and more to the state, and then figure out how to pay for it. Well, of course you can't, arithmetically, until they repeal some basic things like double entry bookkeeping and conventions like that that are inconvenient. You can't pay for it, so what will happen is we will resort to the unlegislated tax of inflation, as Milton Friedman called it, the tax no one has to vote for, which is not quite true, but nevertheless. Inflation is a regressive tax, worsens the distribution of income. It's a divisive tax. It's a dishonest tax. A former Fed governor once said, a place that tolerates inflation is a place that where no one tells the truth, having in mind what is the role of money, which I do want to spend a few minutes talking about. And it rips at the social fabric. And to the extent that you're a country like the United States, that you can impose the inflation tax on foreign holders of your debt, it's the ultimate taxation without representation. Impose it on the foreigners. Where I want to start is something that is not in the paper, but Mexico, 1994, 1995. A change of administrations. Every 6 years they get a new president. Every 6 years they have a devaluation of their currency and reset and sometimes have to nationalize the banking system. In 1994, they had been issuing a lot of securities denominated in US dollars with a real interest rate guaranteed by the government to the foreign holders of these bonds, called tesobonos. And it was all going along just fine for a while, as long as they had high internal real growth in Mexico relative to the real interest rate in those bonds. And then kapoom, it was over. And the whole scheme collapsed. And after nationalizing the banks, then denationalizing the banks, privatizing them back into the hands mostly of foreign owners. Now there are no Mexican banks as such left after it. Getting some monetary stability, and the peso is more or less trading in a narrow range against the dollar. One might look at it and say, well, the crisis is over. It was a financial crisis, it was a banking crisis, a monetary crisis. It finally came to an end, and they've been going along fairly well for about 10 years now. And that would be false, because the real damage of that was not to the issue of money or banks per se, but it was to contracts and the rule of law and property. Because what happened in the 94-95 episode is the courts in Mexico, most law in Mexico is in the state courts, 30 states, refused to enforce loans backed by real property. After that, you could not make, and still cannot today, 15 years later, make a collateralized loan. A bank has no recourse to the courts to evict a tenant or to repossess property. So there is no lending for mortgages, for businesses, for farms, for other purposes that requires collateral. And you can imagine what that is doing to economic development and progress in Mexico. Everything gravitates to the state. As a result, the only way you can have new houses built is the government builds them, because the government can make a loan to a homeowner, because if the homeowner does not perform in the loan to the government, well, the government's got guns, and they don't need the courts to repossess the property. They have a different way to do it. The reason I find that especially troubling as a historical development is over the last couple of years, what we have seen is in various parts of the United States, the local sheriff's department refuses to issue an eviction notice or to carry it out, even if the judge writes it. The current Attorney General of Connecticut, running for the United States, he's an Attorney General, law enforcement officer, wants a moratorium on home mortgage foreclosures for at least a couple of years. The banks would not be allowed to collect repossessed property or foreclose on them. So it's an erosion of property rights, erosion of contracts, and a market economy is a contract economy. It is a property economy, and if we allow those things to be eroded because of what is basically a financial crisis, we're in real deep soup very soon. I'm going to back up 5 years or so from the 94-95 Mexico situation. I was traveling around in Yugoslavia when there was still a Yugoslavia in 1990 and hearing about their banking system and lecturing about Western-type banking. And I would say, well, you know, they'd say, we need mortgages and we need car loans and things. And I'd say, well, you need contracts and you need courts that will enforce property rights. And they say, no, that'll take decades to reform the laws. We need loans. And I say, well, you need contracts and you need... And we weren't making much progress. They explained to me that the government of Yugoslavia was doing, in Belgrade, was doing a wonderful thing. It was offering to the people that you can make deposits in Deutschmarks in the Yugoslav banks with a 4% real interest rate guaranteed by the federal government in Deutschmarks. And I thought, well, where's the Deutschmarks? Where do they get the Deutschmarks for this? They don't have a printing press, or maybe counterfeit, I'm not sure. But when you have a positive real interest rate on an external liability and the economy is contracting, at that point about 15% annual rate, I wrote a little essay called Yugoslav Ponzi Banks and helped trigger a run on the banking system because they were issuing a guarantee that could not be met. It was simply impossible to fulfill that promise. And I started thinking later about a government making a promise it could not fulfill, and Mexico certainly did that in the case of the Teso Bonos they were issuing to foreign countries. But just a couple of years later, we had the Asia debt crisis. What were the root components of the Asia debt crisis? It was that governments throughout the region were guaranteeing loans and investments, mostly of foreigners coming. Somebody borrowed 1% in Japan and lend it in Thailand or Taiwan for 15%. And you don't need an MBA to figure out how to make money on that, guaranteed by the taxpayers of these countries. And they were making guarantees that they could not fulfill. Absolutely, arithmetically, could not fulfill the promises they were making. And China had some of the problem with their JITICs. But very short term after that, did we learn our lesson? No. We had long-term capital management that was making promises that it could fulfill. That could not fulfill. That was not a government, but still they were making promises that could not be fulfilled. Russia, in their debt situation, had made a lot of promises they couldn't fulfill. And where are we now? State and local governments, pension funds of school teachers, firemen, policemen, all of the employees of many of the states in the United States, the U.S. federal government, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and then, of course, Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, making promises that they cannot fulfill in real goods terms. The promise is in nominal claims terms. So we have what James Buchanan recently called monetary anarchy, that you can issue a claim on future consumption denominated in a nominal currency that cannot be fulfilled in real consumption terms. So we've followed up the end of the Cold War when the Berlin Wall came down with the era of promise breakers. And the promise breakers are governments in many of the Western democracies and some of the Asian democracies and others that have issued promises to their own people that simply cannot be fulfilled. What follows it all, I don't know. We'll talk about it. Thank you.